Hey guys, I think it's already time for another workshop, so it's 11:30 now. So welcome to the Package Managers workshop, which is about unlocking the power of open source, being able to create or get libraries in the open source community. So looking at the content of this workshop, we're going to go through what are package managers. We're going to be doing some installations with package managers. We're going to be doing a little bit of the log files, like trying to understand what it is. With the package manager, we're going to look into a couple of different files that are used to manage packages, such as, for example, the package.json that you might be familiar of with JavaScript. And then a little bit of some questions. When do we install things globally? And some demonstration on using or consuming a library. Okay? So firstly, what are package managers? So the package managers are developer tools that allows you to access libraries. Something that I also got there. They're also like a developer tool to actually install CLI commands or basically other tools that may help you in terms of the development process. And here's are a couple of examples. You have NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. You have Yarn, which is just a much more optimized part of NPM installation. You have Python. You might be familiar of pip because we use that a fair bit in terms of the other workshops. You also, in the project for Waze, we're also using Poetry in terms of package management. It's just a better, Poetry just gives you a much more kind of NPM or Yarn feel of installing packages because it does the package management, log files, and all sorts of other things for you that pip doesn't do. Okay? So this is what the package manager data flow looks like. So you have some sort of system. You're going to use a package manager. It's going to contact a repository for a package management thing. It's going to have your package metadata and you have your packages. You also have your dependencies of the packages. This is also known as what's called sub-dependencies. So just to give some examples, you have npmjs.com, which contains a fair bit of library that you may be able to use. So when we say, for example, npm express.js, it's always gonna give you the npm.js thing. There's also the Python, I forgot the repository, but when you just install something like NumPy, actually not, let's go with NumPy. Actually, let's go with a much more library that's not known, which is maybe Python Bleach for cyber or data cleaning. You have the PyPy repository that you're going to see, and it basically has a couple of information similar to npm as well. Okay. Going back to the topic, so I just put a little bit of some memes over here, which is technically in the modern days of infrastructure development, we're going to have the top libraries always at the top, and you might be able to see some sort of news coming around when libraries like around the bottom collapse and things just don't go the right way. Some example that I can say is what's called the pad left JavaScript incident or something like that, wherein something there's a library that basically this is its content, and because there's a lot of project that basically uses this library, and then that library just suddenly disappeared and basically caused a chaos somewhere in the open source of JavaScript. That's an example. Something that you may also have heard of is the log4j vulnerability. So log4j is a library for logging in Java systems, but like a lot of the modern infrastructure, because they use a library that may also use another library, and that library may end up using log4j, then that technically makes your infrastructure, in some extent, vulnerable. So that's also as to why I'm pointing out, libraries, they're good to install and they help you a lot. But something that you have to be aware of is things that may break your project. And here are examples of actual libraries in terms of their dependency. So there's a tool over here. If you want to take a look, it basically helps you visualize dependencies. So here's a couple of examples. We have the Material UI core. This is its ecosystem and basically the libraries that it uses. So as you can see over here, it kind of uses quite a number of libraries. So in these days and ages, your usual libraries, if you have just a normal project, even if you install one library, you may be indirectly also using maybe 100 libraries because that library alone uses some other libraries. Here's another example, which is Express.js. A couple of different libraries it has. You have right here, and yeah, looks like a node, and it is. Right. Package managers. So these are the different ways to install the package managers. So you have npm over here, you have yarn, pip, poetry, and if you just want to install it, you just go to the relevant URLs and it'll get you there. Okay. Now that you know a little bit much more about package managers, let's talk about a couple of the important files that you will encounter, which is package.json in terms of the JavaScript one. So here's a actual example of your food bank project, and we can divide that into 4 main parts. So firstly, you have this one. This is called the package headers and also meta information. This is encompassing from line 2 over to line 20. It basically just contains information about the project and it's used for publication when you're going to publish libraries. And let's just go to Express, for example. So you have this type of meta information, repository, homepage. You may even have the version over here and some other things. So if you take a look at back here, you actually have repository over here. You may even have authors, your license. But basically, when you publish libraries, it'll pre-fill this information for you. That's that one. The next one that you may be familiar of is the scripts. This is probably the moment where we're going to discover what's the magic around when you type npm run start, npm run dev. So basically, these scripts are just alias of commands to run using modules in the dependencies. So for example, if I type yarn start, what actually happens under the hood, actually I don't have a yarn start over here. Let's do yarn dev. If you type yarn dev, it actually runs this command, next dev. I can demonstrate that later. There's also a reason as to why you're going to run yarn dev comparatively to running next dev just directly. This one, if you run it, it's just gonna say command not found because that particular command can only be found in the node modules folder, which by default, if you run it by yarn with a scripts command, it will basically always include that. Alright. Next one is the dependencies. So these are the libraries that are used in your project. To add the dependency, you just say yarn add and then the library name. You have to research what the library name is to make sure that you don't install the wrong library. And this is the equivalent in terms of npm install format. So what it just does is that it'll just add another entry over here. I'll just give you a little bit of run through over here. So this is your dependency name and this is your version. This is what's called a major version. Majority of the time, you don't want to be changing the major version because future version may sometimes deprecate or basically remove functions that are used in the next version up. This is what's called a minor version. and this one is a patch version. Patch versions are basically used when there's only really a small change, but that change is like very much, I would say, backwards compatible. They're usually just patches, like for example, security patches or just tiny bugs that they may do. Minor version is kind of like introducing a feature, but it's not actually breaking anything. So that's what minor version is used for. Alright. Next is our development dependencies. So development dependencies, these are the libraries that are used on the project for development environments. So typically you're going to have your linters and also a little bit of your automated testing as part of that one. In the foodbank project, you're going to see a couple of things. You're going to usually see this ESLint and also your TypeScripts for your React project. And also TypeScript over here. Okay? Now that you know that, let's talk about a little bit about lock files. So lock files are used for locking the dependencies and also sub-dependencies. It's essentially the dependency of the dependency of your application the last time it was installed correctly. Okay? Let's take a look at an example from the Waste project, which is their yarn lock file. So as you can see over here, like we have so much dependencies over here, like it spans up so much that if I go to maybe the most bottom down, it's gonna be like around 9,272. You don't have to understand every single part of this file, but the only thing you have to understand with this file is what is it even used for. Okay? So there are cases that when you install these libraries, they may have different sub-dependencies. So what happens, like going back to an incident, which is the pad left, you may not be using that library directly, but because if you have a library that you use and that library also uses another library, then technically you have to make sure that those sub-dependencies don't change. Because there may be a very small chance that a sub-dependency will break your application. So a lock file essentially does is that it also keeps track of the dependency at the bottom layer. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. I think that's majority of the package management. Now let's talk about like when do we actually install things globally. So global installation is really frowned upon, particularly because you don't always use the same packages or library versions for different projects. So maybe in another project I'm using Next.js version 10. In another project I'm using Next.js version 12. If I install it globally, then there is a big chance that if I move from project to project, my development environment basically breaks. So it's always good that you do not install with -g or global when you're using yarn. Alright? And also, if you do installation of global, it actually does not track it in the package.json file, which makes your project even harder to replicate. So something to be aware of, it applies for almost anything. You install it in pip. I think with pip, it's always encouraged that you create a virtual environment to actually install that to a specific place instead of installing it to a global Python instance. Alright? But there may be cases that you want to install things globally. And here's a particular example, which is with a Firebase CLI. What if you want to start your own project and you want to use the Firebase tools commands? So this is technically some way to do it. So you want to install it globally, Firebase tools, and then you can run Firebase command like Firebase init, and it will basically allow you to do these things. Alright? So now let's get into a little bit of demo. So firstly, I'm going to do an explanation on what npx is. So npx, I forgot what it means, but npx is basically trying to get a executable in a repository, like for example create next app, and basically I can use that thing without actually installing it globally. It just installs it like some sort of caching things. So I can basically do create next app over here, and I can say package manager demo. The other way to do it, if you're not going to use npx, you're gonna have to do npm install -g, so installing it globally, and I have to do create next app. And then after that, I'm not going to install it, but like just for demonstration, after doing that, I can do create next app. And then I can type the same commands that I had, which is the package manager demo. So just an alternative way to do it. But for this case, I'll be using npx. Okay. Now let's take a look at this one. So I just have to cd onto my package manager demo. So I'm in this folder over here. So I forgot to remove that one, but essentially I'm installing Material UI. So the basic way to basically install anything, you're just gonna say Material UI or something, and then install. It's going to take you to the documentation, and it's basically going to give you this instructions: yarn add, yarn things. So for us, let's do yarn add on this one. You may even add a couple of things, like for example, the icons library right there. Before I do that, let's take a look at our package.json. So take a look at this. You have your scripts over here. I have my dependencies over here, my dev dependencies. Let me just initialize this as a repository. Oh, forgot to initialize it, but anyways, so if I add this one, it will install my packages. My packages are located at the node modules folder. This is also the reason as to why you always want to put your node modules as part of your git ignore, because this is actually a very big file. It contains your installations of your dependencies and sub-dependencies. Just to demonstrate it, let's take a look at just the size of it. Hopefully I can just do a get info. Calculating size. Oh man, it may take a while. But essentially, majority of the time, your node modules will probably be around, let's say, yeah, like hundreds of megabytes. In this case, it's 240 megabytes. So you don't want to commit that into a Git repository. Okay? While we're waiting for this one, let's take a look at our package lock file. So this one is package-lock.json. But if you're using a yarn, it's gonna create a new file called yarn.lock. It is advisable that you're only going to use one package manager. So if I'm using yarn, I have to maintain yarn.lock. If I'm using just straight up just npm, just the package manager, then I'll be using package-lock.json. So in this case, because I installed yarn over here, it's advisable that I actually remove this one, because it basically covers that information over here. Take a look at package.json. Take a look at over here. These are the new things that we basically installed. So if you take a look at the command, MUI material, emotion react, right over here, emotion styled, and MUI icons material. Okay? something to note of is some question that you may have is why do we have I forgot what this character is. Essentially, why do we have this character over here? So this character essentially signifies that whenever we're trying to install this application, it doesn't actually care about this part. It only cares about your major version. So when there's a new version that comes in, maybe I have 5.0 over there, it may install 5.24 instead of 5.0.0. Okay? So just to be aware of that. Okay? Now I can do yarn dev, yarn start. But essentially, let's take a look at this one. So if I do a yarn dev over here, notice this command over here. It basically runs this command as part of the node modules thing. If I try to run that, it's just gonna say command not found. Okay? And I can do all sorts of other things over here, run other commands. Maybe I want to create other commands, my own commands. I can say custom, and maybe it does an ls right here. I can do now yarn custom. It basically run that command. Actually, I made a mistake right here. As you can see, it just runs this command. You can get more creative on this one. Maybe you have ESLint or something, and so on. Alright. Now that we've installed Material UI over here, we can take a look into how to consume that library. Alright. So firstly, when you are looking at a particular library, make sure you've installed it, and then you can take a look at some demos over here, some code demos, right over here. As you can see over here, the reference of the import will always correspond to, majority of the time, right over here, the name of its dependency. If you want to be very particular and taking a look at where it is, it's going to be located somewhere here. So /MUI over here, /materials, or icons. Okay? But because we have that library installed, we can just essentially, majority of the time, if you're prototyping, you can just copy paste this, all of this, and figure out what's missing or something like that. I do yarn dev. Let's take a look at if it errors out. If things just works, I've installed the correct packages, it'll just work. No, we're just waiting. And yeah, it essentially looks like that. So let's just go on. Before it looked like that. I just removed some of the boilerplate code. I just copy pasted the one that's written in the Material UI documentation right over here. And yeah, I can extend this further, as in like I can read the documentation further to look at other things. Maybe let's say I want some form of menu or maybe an app bar. So app bar code will essentially look something like that. Let's take a look at copy pasting that over right here. There's going to be some issues over here, because duplicated packages. It's going to appear somewhere. It says I need some additional loaders. It's actually quite possible I do need some additional loaders. I do just that, and maybe I put it at the top right here. I surround this with a div, and I put it right here. Okay, now I have an app bar over here, and then I have this one right here. And as you can see here, like traditionally wherein we don't have libraries, we have to make essentially create these individual components altogether. But because we have this library, Material UI, which is a component library, we can just install its library and essentially import a couple of things and essentially do a lot of the stylings for us. So in less than like 70 lines of code, we're basically going to have this type of interface. And I think you can see how this will scale up. Maybe I want more complex features, for example, a data grid, which is a table that has a lot of functionalities like that. That's filtering. You can even do different stylings, exporting to CSV, and all sorts of other filterings. And this is the code for that. This one is just for stylings, so you don't have to worry about that one. It's mainly on this one. But yeah, that's something to get you started. I think that finishes our package manager workshop. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.